The sun, a pale and hesitant disk, struggled to free itself from the jagged teeth of the eastern mountains. Its weak light did little to warm the deep perpetual shadow that clung to the village of the Mahkah clan, a shadow born not of the land but of the heart. In a lodge smelling of smoked elk and dried herbs, a young woman named Nannook stirred the embers of a dying fire. Her name meant polar bear, a spirit of fierce strength and resilience, a name her father had given her in hope. But this morning, the weight of it felt like a burden. The air was thick with the tension of impending conflict, a familiar song whose verses were written in blood and grief. Her people, the Mahkah, the people of the forest and the wolf, had been locked in a generations-old feud with the Tikaani, the people of the lake and the eagle. The origin was a story worn smooth by countless tellings, a dispute over hunting grounds that had spiraled into a vortex of vengeance, each death demanding another, each raid etching the hatred deeper into their souls. Nannook's own uncle had fallen to a Tikaani arrow 2 winters past. His empty place by the fire was a constant, cold reminder. Her father, Chogon, a man whose face was a map of old sorrows and new worries, entered the lodge. The scouts have returned. They found Tikaani sign near the salmon runs. They grow bold, stealing our lifeblood. His voice was a low growl, the sound of the wolf for which their clan was named. Nannook nodded, her jaw tight. We will drive them out. The words were automatic, a ritual response learned from infancy. But as she said them, a strange hollowness echoed in her chest. She looked at the small pouch of charms she carried, gifts from her grandmother, a wolf's tooth, a smoothed river stone, an eagle feather she had found as a child, its possession a secret shame. She could feel the spirits in them, faint whispers on the edge of her hearing, but their messages were always clouded by the fog of her clan's anger. Be vigilant, Chogon said, his hand resting heavily on her shoulder. The world is not safe. The Tikaani are cunning and without honor. Meanwhile, a day's hard walk to the south, in a village of birchbark wigwams overlooking a vast, shimmering lake, another young woman felt the same oppressive weight. Kanti, whose name sang of the sky, felt anything but boundless. The expectations of her Tikaani clan were a tight band around her chest. She was the daughter of their war chief, Ahanu, a man whose pride was as deep as the lake and just as cold. She was renowned for her skill with the bow, her arrows said to fly with the eagle's keen eye and deadly precision. It was a praise that curdled in her stomach. That morning, she had been tasked with scouting the northern woods, the disputed territory that bordered Mahkah land. Her father's instructions had been simple, his eyes hard. See how far their arrogance extends. Show them the price of trespassing. Kanti had nodded, the familiar knot of dread tightening within her. She collected her bow, a beautiful, supple piece of yew, and a quiver of arrows fletched with goose feathers. Before leaving, she sought a moment of quiet at the water's edge. She whispered a prayer to the water spirits, to the eagle that was her clan's totem, asking for clarity, for a sign that the path of endless bloodshed was not the only one. The water lapped gently at the shore, offering no answer, its secrets kept hidden beneath a placid surface. The two young women, unknowing mirrors of each other's discontent, moved through the ancient pine forest. The trees, giants who had witnessed the feud's first spark, stood in silent judgment. Nannook moved with a hunter's quiet grace, her senses attuned to the language of the woods, the scold of a squirrel, the drift of a hawk on the thermals, the scent of damp earth and pine resin. She was seeking solitude more than game, a respite from the suffocating atmosphere of her village. She found herself drawn to a place she had not visited since childhood, a hidden bend in the Ikotmi River, the very river that marked the unofficial and violently contested border between the Mahkah and Tikaani lands. It was a place her grandmother had once called a Tapu, a spirit crossing, a thin place between worlds. The Mahkah usually avoided it, fearing the confluence of energies, but Nannook had always felt a strange pull to its quiet power. The river here widened into a small, crystalline pool, sheltered by weeping willows and giant ferns. The air hummed with a subtle energy, and the light seemed to dance differently. Stripping off her travel-worn clothes, she waded into the shockingly cold water, gasping as it washed over her skin. She submerged herself, hoping the river's flow could cleanse not just the dust from her body, but the bitterness from her spirit. She closed her eyes, floating on her back, and for a fleeting moment, she felt peace. The whispers of the forest spirits seemed clearer here, a wordless song of balance and ancient time. It was at that precise moment of vulnerability that Kanti emerged from the treeline. Her scout's path had also been drawn inexplicably toward this specific bend in the river. She froze, her hand immediately going to an arrow. There, in the water, was a Mahkah warrior. The enemy. The shape of the woman's clan markings was unmistakable, a story of hatred etched into the very skin of her shoulder. Every lesson, every story of Mahkah brutality, every memory of her cousin's funeral scream echoed in Kanti's mind. This was a trespass. This was an opportunity. Her body moved with a trained, lethal efficiency. Bow raised, arrow knocked, drawstring taut against her cheek. The eagle's eye focused. The target was perfect, exposed. One shot. One less wolf to prey upon her people. It would be a victory to bring to her father. Her breath stilled. Her finger began to tighten. And then, the woman in the water opened her eyes. They were not the eyes of a monster. They were not filled with the savage hatred Kanti had been taught to expect. They were deep and dark, like still forest pools, and in them, Kanti saw not an enemy, but a person. A woman, like herself, seeking a moment of peace. She saw a flicker of surprise, then not fear, but a profound and startling sadness. In that suspended heartbeat, the stories of her clan shattered. The spirit of the eagle, which usually guided her aim with ruthless certainty, seemed to stall its wings. A different whisper, older and quieter, brushed against her soul, the whisper of the river itself, of the willow branches sighing, a chorus pleading for a different choice. But the impulse was too deeply ingrained. Her finger completed its motion. The arrow released. It was not a clean shot. It was not the kill shot of a master archer. It was a frantic, conflicted thing, its path deflected by a last-minute tremor, a spiritual rebellion of the hand that loosed it. Instead of striking the heart, it buried itself deep in Nannook's shoulder. A cry, sharp and pained, shattered the sanctuary's silence. Nannook's eyes, wide with shock and betrayal, locked onto Kanti's for one searing moment before she stumbled, the crimson bloom of her blood spreading through the clear water. Horror, immediate and absolute, swallowed Kanti whole. The bow fell from her numb fingers, clattering on the stones. What had she done? The woman's eyes, those deep, sad eyes, were burned into her vision. This was not a victory. This was a desecration. She had violated the peace of this sacred place. She had shot a person who was unarmed, at peace. The stories of Mahkah treachery she had been fed all her life suddenly tasted like ash. She waded into the icy water, her own heart hammering a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. Nannook was struggling to stand, her face pale, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She tried to reach for the arrow, her movements clumsy with shock and pain. Kanti reached her, her hands trembling. "Do not touch it," Kanti said, her voice a strangled whisper, foreign to her own ears. "It will make it worse." Nannook flinched away, a snarl forming on her lips. "Tikaani snake. Finish it then." The words were a physical blow. Kanti shook her head, a desperate, frantic motion. No. No, I will not. I am sorry. Forgive me. Please let me help. The apology was ripped from a place so deep inside her she hadn't known it existed. It was an apology not just for the arrow, but for generations of hatred. Something in the raw, unfeigned anguish in Kanti's voice gave Nannook pause. The expected blow did not come. The Tikaani woman was not reaching for a knife. Her hands were empty, held out in a gesture of helpless supplication. The world narrowed to the two of them, the cold water, the shared, shocking pain, and the impossible words of remorse from an enemy's lips. Nannook, her strength fading, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the permission Kanti needed. She moved quickly, tearing a strip from her own tunic to staunch the bleeding. She broke the arrow's shaft, leaving the cruel head embedded for now. We must get you to shore. You need warmth. Herbs. Somehow, with Nannook leaning heavily against her, they managed to stumble out of the river and onto the mossy bank. The divide between Mahkah and Tikaani had been crossed, not with weapons, but with a wounded body and a supporting arm. Kanti found a small, dry cave hidden behind a curtain of vines not far from the pool, a place that felt protected, secret. She built a small, smokeless fire with practiced skill and went to forage, her knowledge of healing plants, a skill taught by her own grandmother, a woman of peace who had always clashed with the war chiefs, coming to the forefront. She returned with yarrow to pack the wound, willow bark for the pain and fever, and moss for a clean dressing. As she worked, her touch was surprisingly gentle, her focus absolute. Nannook watched her through a haze of pain, her mind reeling. This enemy, this Tikaani, was saving her life. She was humming a low, soothing tune as she worked, a lullaby Nannook did not recognize but whose melody felt ancient and calming. Why? Nannook finally whispered, her voice hoarse. Why did you not kill me? Kanti's hands stilled for a moment. She would not meet Nannook's gaze. I saw your eyes, she said simply, as if that explained everything. And the spirits of this place, they would not let me. She finished tying the moss dressing and sat back, finally looking at Nannook. Her own eyes were filled with a turmoil that mirrored Nannook's pain. I am Kanti. The offering of a name was a profound act. It was an act of identity, of humanity. It was a refusal to be just the enemy. Nannook, she replied, the word a breath of surrender. For days, they existed in that fragile, hidden world. Nannook's fever raged, and Kanti never left her side, cooling her brow with damp cloths, forcing infusions of bitter tea between her lips, singing that soft, haunting lullaby. In her delirious dreams, Nannook spoke of her father's grief, of the empty place by the fire, of the weight of being the strong one, the polar bear. Kanti listened, and the portrait of the enemy, already cracked, dissolved completely. She saw a daughter, a clanswoman, a person burdened by the same legacy of loss that she was. When the fever broke, and Nannook awoke clear-eyed, they began to talk. Tentatively at first, then with a rushing, desperate need. They spoke of their families, their lives, the constant shadow of the feud. They discovered a shared love for the same stories, though told from opposing sides. They found a mutual reverence for the spirits of the land, a connection that their war chiefs had long ignored in favor of the spirits of war and vengeance. Nannook learned that Kanti's arrow was famous, that she was called Eagle's daughter by her people, a title she despised for the death it represented. Kanti learned that Nannook could hear the whispers of the wolf spirits, that she often felt their mournful howls were not cries for blood, but songs of sorrow for the fractured land. Their world shrank to the confines of the cave and the riverbank. The outside world, with its hatred and its war cries, ceased to exist. In its place, something new and terrifyingly beautiful began to grow. It started with a shared glance held a moment too long, with the accidental brush of a hand while passing a waterskin, with the deep comfort found in the other's silent presence. The line between caretaker and patient, between enemy and ally, blurred and then vanished. One evening, under a blanket of stars so thick it seemed you could reach up and gather them in your hands, they sat by the river. Nannook's shoulder was healing, though a scar would remain, a permanent memory of their meeting. "My people believe those stars are the campfires of our ancestors," Kanti said softly, pointing to a bright cluster. "My grandmother said they are the eyes of the first animals, watching over us to see if we remember the old ways of balance," Nannook replied. They looked at each other then, and the truth that had been weaving itself around them for days became undeniable. The space between them closed not with hesitation, but with a sense of inevitability, as natural as the river flowing to the sea. Their first kiss was not an act of conquest, but of discovery. It was gentle and tentative, a question and an answer all at once. It tasted of willow bark and hope, and it held the power to rewrite the world. In that kiss, the feud, the clans, the generations of hatred, it all fell away, leaving only the two of them and the profound, shocking certainty of their love. But the outside world had not forgotten them. In the Mahkah village, Shogun's worry had curdled into a cold, hard fury. His daughter, his strong Nannook, was missing. Scouts had found signs of a struggle by the river, a splash of blood on the stones, a broken Tikaani arrow. The conclusion was inevitable. The Tikaani had taken her, or worse. Grief and rage swept through the clan like a wildfire. War chants echoed through the trees. They blamed the Tikaani hawks for stealing one of their own. In the Tikaani village, the same storm was brewing. Kanti, their prized archer, had vanished. Scouts reported Mahkah tracks near the river, and the discovery of a Mahkah hunting knife near the border was all the evidence Ahanu needed. The Mahkah wolves had ambushed his daughter. His grief was a cold stone, his rage a sharpened blade. He vowed a retaliation that would finally end the wolf people for good. The land braced itself for a storm of blood, a final, cataclysmic battle fueled by the absence of the two young women whose disappearance each clan blamed on the other. Unaware that their absence was about to ignite a war, Nannook and Kanti knew they could not hide forever. Nannook's strength had returned. Their love, forged in secret, now demanded a confrontation with the world. They had to go back. They had to make them see. They had to stop the cycle. They believed, with the foolish and beautiful faith of the newly in love, that the power of what they had found could break the chains of the past. Hand in hand, they left the sanctuary of the river and walked back into the world of men. They approached the contested ground between the villages, a field that had too often been a killing ground. And they found it not empty, but filled with the assembled warriors of both the Mahkah and the Tikaani. Both sides were painted for war, faces twisted in hatred, weapons gleaming in the sun. They were moments from charging, from tearing each other apart. Shogun and Ahanu stood at the forefront of their people, their shouts of accusation crossing the field like spears. "Where is my daughter, wolf?" Ahanu roared. "What have you done with Nannook, hawk?" Shogun bellowed back. And then, as if summoned by the very intensity of their father's rage, the two young women emerged from the treeline. Together. A silence, profound and disbelieving, fell over the field. Hundreds of eyes turned to them. The sight was so incomprehensible it was momentarily paralyzing. Nannook, alive. Kanti, unharmed. Their hands clasped tightly. Their postures were not of captor and captive, but of unity. Of defiance. For a heartbeat, there was hope. Nannook felt it, a fragile bubble rising in her chest. They would see. They would have to see. Chogon took a stumbling step forward, his face a mask of confusion. Nannook? My child. Step away from her. She has enchanted you. This is Tikaani witchcraft. Ahanu's expression was one of pure, icy fury. Kanti. Has this Mahkah dog threatened you? Speak. Have they forced you? The bubble of hope burst. They did not see. They saw only their own stories, their own deeply ingrained narratives of treachery and magic. Their love, the most real thing either of them had ever known, was being interpreted through the lens of the feud. To the Mahkah, Kanti was a sinister sorceress who had bewitched Nannook to dishonor her and her clan. To the Tikaani, Nannook was a vicious kidnapper who had somehow broken their finest archer's spirit. No. Nannook's voice rang out, clear and strong over the field. There is no enchantment. There is no threat. We found each other. We saved each other. Kanti's voice joined hers. The hatred ends here. It is a sickness. We do not have to live this way. Their words meant to heal, only inflamed. The warriors on both sides began to mutter, their confusion turning back to anger, now directed at the two women who dared to stand together. She lies. The hawk has stolen her mind. A Mahkah warrior yelled. The wolf has twisted her words with poison. A Tikaani cried. Shogun's face, once filled with relief, hardened into something cold and disappointed. Nannook, come home. Now. Renounce this trickery. Ahanu's command was a whip crack. Kanti, to my side. Leave that creature. They were given a choice, but it was no choice at all. It was a demand to deny their own hearts, to sever the bond that had saved them, to step back into the old hatred. They looked at each other, and in that look was a shared, devastating understanding. Their truth was too foreign, too threatening. It would not be heard. With a final, agonized look at the fathers and clans who would not see them, they turned. Shoulder to shoulder, they walked away from the battlefield, leaving the stunned silence and rising anger behind them. They had tried. They had failed. They returned to their respective villages, not as heroines or victims, but as outcasts living under a cloud of suspicion and shame. Nannook was treated with a fragile, wary distance. Her people saw the scar on her shoulder not as a wound from an enemy's arrow, but as a mark of a dark pact. They whispered that she had been touched by Tikaani magic, that her spirit was unclean. She was no longer the strong polar bear, but a broken, potentially dangerous thing. She was given chores away from others, and the warm, familiar glances of her childhood were replaced with averted eyes and cold shoulders. Kanti's reception was even worse. She was the daughter of the war chief, the embodiment of Tikaani strength, and she had returned holding the hand of the enemy. Her father's disappointment was a glacial silence that filled their lodge. She was a disgrace, a betrayal of everything he had fought for. Her bow was taken from her. She was no longer Eagle's daughter, but wolf lover, a title spat like a curse. She was confined to the village, her every move watched. For weeks, they endured it. They tried to live the lives expected of them. Nannook tended to the fires, repaired nets, and tried to ignore the whispers. Kanti worked with the weavers, gathered berries under watchful eyes, and tried to breathe through the weight of her father's contempt. They were separated by distance, by suspicion, by the armed patrols that now lined the border, more vigilant than ever. But the distance did not dim their connection, it magnified it. The memory of their time by the river was a constant, aching presence. At night, Nannook would look to the stars, the eyes of the first animals, And no Kanti was looking at the campfires of her ancestors. They were sharing the same sky, breathing the same air, and it was a torture. Their love, denied and vilified, did not wither. It grew roots that reached across the miles, deep and unshakable. They began to take insane risks. Furtive, fleeting meetings in the deepest parts of the woods, moments stolen from the relentless scrutiny of their clans. These meetings were not like the idyllic time by the river. They were charged with fear and desperation, every touch a rebellion, every whispered word an act of treason against their own blood. During one such meeting, in a hollow beneath the roots of a great cedar, Kanti clutched Nannook's hands, her own ice-cold. "I cannot bear it," she whispered, her voice raw. "To see you across the field and have to look away. To hear my father speak of plans to raid your village. Your village, Nannook. To know he wants to hurt the people you love." Nannook pressed her forehead against Kanti's. "My people say the same of yours. The anger is worse now than before we returned. Our love has not brought peace. It has only fed the hatred." The truth of it was a cold stone in their stomachs. They had become a new reason for the old war. Their very existence was a spark threatening to ignite a final conflagration. The breaking point came on the night of a council fire. Nannook, sitting at the edge of the circle, listened as her father and the elders spoke. The talk was not of if they would attack the Tikaani, but when. They spoke of Kanti by name, calling her the witch who had corrupted Nannook, a prime target to break the Tikaani spirit. That same night, in the Tikaani village, Kanti heard similar plans. Ahanu spoke of a targeted strike, of capturing the Mahkah chieftain's daughter to show their weakness, to break their will. He meant Nannook. They had, without intending to, made each other the primary targets of the very war they had hoped to prevent. Their love had painted a target on each other's backs. They met one last time at the hidden river bend, the place where it had all begun. The air was cold now, the willows bare. The sanctuary felt fragile, its magic no match for the hatred that pursued them. "They will use us to destroy each other," Nannook said, her voice hollow. "My father will kill you to free me. Your father will capture me to avenge you. There is no place for us here." Kanti looked at the river, its flow constant and endless. The river does not care about Mahkah or Tikaani. It just flows. The stars do not see clans. They just shine. She turned to Nannook, her eyes filled with a determined grief. "This land is our home, but it has become a prison. Our love has become a weapon for them to use." They stood in silence for a long time, listening to the water, to the wind in the pines, to the distant mournful howl of a wolf, a sound that once meant enemy, but that Nannook now heard as a kindred spirit, lonely and misunderstood. The choice, which had seemed impossible weeks before, was now the only one left. To stay was to be instruments of their own destruction and the destruction of everyone they loved. To leave was to damn it all. To turn their backs on their families, their clans, their ancestors, everything they had ever known. It was to choose a world of uncertainty over a world of certain war. It was to choose each other over everyone else. Nannook took Kanti's hand. Her touch was firm, her decision made. "I would rather be a stranger in an unknown land with you, than a queen in my own land without you." Kanti laced their fingers together, a tear tracing a path through the charcoal smudges on her cheek, the remnants of her Tikaani markings. "Then we flow like the river," she whispered. "We go where the spirits guide us. Together." They did not go back for belongings. Their clans had already taken everything they could offer except their hearts, and those they would not give. They turned their backs on the lands of the wolf and the eagle and walked north, toward the high, lonely passes where the air was thin and the old maps held no clan markings. They were two women, alone against the wilderness, armed with nothing but a stolen knife, a knowledge of the land, and a love that was stronger than heritage, stronger than hatred, stronger than history. Behind them, the feud would rage on, fed by new grievances. But ahead of them, there was only the vast, open sky, the silent mountains, and the fragile, terrifying hope of a world they would have to build for themselves, a world where the only clan that mattered was the one they made with their joined hands. They walked away from the war, and in doing so, they won their only possible peace. The world beyond the contested lands was a vast, breathing entity of stone and silence. The familiar territories of the Mahkah and the Tikaani, with their well-worn paths and spirit-marked trees, fell away behind them, replaced by a raw, unmapped expanse. The air grew sharper, tasting of ice and distant, unseen peaks. They were two specks moving through an ancient geography that held no memory of their clan's feud, a profoundly humbling and terrifying truth. The first nights were the hardest. Without the shelter of a lodge or even a familiar cave, the cold was a predatory thing that stalked them, sinking its teeth deep into their bones. They huddled together for warmth in shallow depressions beneath rocky overhangs, wrapped in the single woolen blanket Kanti had the foresight to snatch from a drying line as they fled. Their sleep was fitful, punctuated by the strange cries of night birds and the constant, gnawing awareness of their own vulnerability. Hunger was a constant companion. Their knowledge of the forest was vast, but this high country offered different bounty. They found solace in the meticulous, shared task of survival. Nannook's strength, returning fully now that she was free from the poison of her clan's suspicion, was used to move stones for a better windbreak, to set sturdy snares for snowhares. Kanti's keen eyes and patient hands gathered lichen that could be boiled into a bitter but nourishing tea, and identified a hardy, blue-tinted berry that clung to life in the lee of boulders. Their journey was not a straight line north but a navigation of necessity, seeking passes that were not yet choked with snow, following streams that promised lower valleys. They spoke little in those first days, their energy reserved for the physical demands of their flight. But their silence was a language in itself. A touch on the arm to point out a potential path. A shared look of understanding when the wind shifted. The way Kanti would automatically check the healing scar on Nannook's shoulder each morning, her touch now one of familiarity and care, not just healing. One afternoon, a week into their exile, they found a high meadow, a bowl of golden grass sheltered by granite cliffs. A thin waterfall, like a silver thread, cascaded down one rock face into a clear, icy pool. It was a place of stunning, untouched beauty. For the first time since they had left, the knot of fear in Nannook's chest loosened its grip. "We could stay here for a day," she suggested, her voice raspy from disuse. "Rest. Hunt properly." Kanti nodded, her eyes scanning the cliffs. "There are mountain goat trails. And the water is good." She turned to Nannook, a faint smile touching her lips, the first in days. "It feels unclaimed." They built a more substantial fire that night, daring to let it burn a little brighter, a little longer. The warmth was a luxury they had almost forgotten. They roasted a fat hare that had been caught in one of Nannook's snares, and the taste of hot, greasy meat was a profound pleasure. Sitting by the fire, the vast canopy of stars overhead, the world did not feel so hostile. "Do you think they are still looking for us?" Kanti asked quietly, her gaze fixed on the flames. Nannook followed her look. "My father? Yes. But not to welcome me home. To bring back the dishonored daughter and the Tikaani witch. To make an example." The words were bitter, but the pain behind them was a dull ache now, not a sharp wound. "My father believes he is saving me from corruption," Kanti said. His search will be one of anger. He would rather see me dead than this. She gestured between them, to the shared blanket, the shared meal, the shared life. The silence that followed was filled with the crackle of the fire and the weight of their renunciation. They had not just left their homes, they had been erased from their own histories, their stories rewritten into cautionary tales of betrayal. "We are not what they say," Nannook said, her voice firm, as if trying to convince the stars themselves. "This," she said, taking Kanti's hand, "is not corruption. It is the only thing that has ever felt purely right." Kanti turned her hand over, lacing their fingers together. "Then we must make a new story. For ourselves." The next day, while Kanti worked on tanning the hare's hide with a mixture of brain and smoke, a painstaking process she'd learned from her grandmother, Nannook climbed the highest of the surrounding cliffs. She needed a vantage point, to see what lay ahead. The climb was arduous, the rock cold and sharp against her palms. But when she pulled herself onto the flat summit, the breath was stolen from her lungs. Before her stretched a range of mountains so vast and mighty they seemed to hold up the sky. Their peaks were white with eternal snow, and between them lay deep, shadowed valleys filled with mist. It was a land of immense power and profound isolation. There was no sign of human life, no smoke from a distant fire, no cleared hunting grounds. It was both a prison and a sanctuary. As she stood there, a wind swept up from the valley below, carrying with it a strange, low-thrumming sound, like a giant's heartbeat. It was a sound that vibrated in her own chest, and for a moment she felt a presence, old, immense, and utterly indifferent to her. It was the spirit of the mountains themselves. It did not welcome her, but it did not reject her. It simply was. She felt a strange sense of peace. They were insignificant here. Their love, their loss, their conflict, it was all tiny before this ancient grandeur. When she descended, her face was thoughtful. "The mountains are endless," she told Kanti. "But there is a spirit there. It is quiet." Kanti looked up from her scraping. "Quiet is good. The spirits of our old lands were always shouting. Shouting for blood, for vengeance." She paused. "I have been listening here. The whispers are different. They speak of rock and ice and time. They do not care about Mahkah or Tikaani." This became their new ritual. As they traveled, they learned to listen to the new spirits of their world. Nannook, who had always communed with the wolf, now found herself understanding the patient, relentless nature of the lichen clinging to the rock, the stubborn resilience of the stunted pine trees that grew sideways in the wind. Kanti, whose spirit had always been tied to the eagle's keen sight and lofty perspective, now sought guidance from the clever, burrowing marmot and the unpredictable, trickster spirit of the sudden avalanche. Their magic, their spirituality began to shift. It was no longer the clan magic of petitioning a totem for victory in battle or a successful hunt. It became a practical, daily dialogue with the world around them for simple survival. A request to the spirit of the stream to reveal a fish. A thankfulness to the spirit of the sun for one more day of warmth. It was a quieter, more humble form of witchcraft, born of necessity and respect. They found a valley, deeper than the others, where a hot spring steamed alongside the icy water of a river, creating a fringe of startling green vegetation even as the first snows began to dust the higher ground. The contrast between the freezing air and the warm, mineral-scented water was magical. They decided to stop wandering. Using skills from both their heritages, they built a shelter. It was not a Mahkah lodge or a Tikaani wigwam, but something new, a low, sturdy hut of stone and sod, dug into the side of a hill for protection, with a roof of woven branches and layered hides. It was small and dark, but it was theirs. The first night they spent under its roof, listening to the wind howl outside but feeling secure in their own creation, was a milestone more significant than any clan ceremony. As the moon cycled, their new life settled into a rhythm. Nannook hunted. Kanti foraged and preserved. They learned each other's rhythms and moods. They had disagreements, sharp words born of fatigue and fear, but the arguments always ended in the shared understanding that they only had each other. Their love was no longer the frantic, desperate thing it had been by the river, nor the defiant flame of their public stand. It deepened into something steady and unwavering, the central pillar of their existence. It was in the way Kanti would always save the most tender piece of meat for Nannook, and the way Nannook would instinctively position herself between Kanti and the prevailing wind. Yet, the old world was not done with them. One evening, Nannook returned from checking her trap lines empty-handed and with a grim expression. "I found tracks today," she said, brushing snow from her shoulders. "A hunting party. Mahkah." Kanti's blood ran cold. "Here? How far?" "A day's journey, down the eastern ridge. They were tracking a wounded elk. They will not have seen our sign. But they were close." The sanctuary of their valley suddenly felt thin, its walls of rock and distance paper-thin. The past had claws, and they could still reach this far. A few days later, it was Kanti's turn to bring news. She had climbed to their old lookout point and had seen a column of smoke far to the south, too organized and dense to be a natural fire. "It is a signal fire," she said, her voice tight. "Tikaani. They are searching. Coordinating." The ghosts of their fathers, of their clans, were circling the edges of their paradise. The fear was a taste of metal on their tongues. Their love had built a world, but the old world of hatred was still looking for them, and it would not rest until it had swallowed them whole. The choice to leave had been made, but the consequences of that choice were a path they would have to walk every day for the rest of their lives, always listening for the sound of footsteps that did not belong to the mountain goats, always watching the southern horizons for the smoke of the world they had damned. Their peace was hard-won, and it would be a constant, vigilant battle to keep it. They had each other, but the shadow of the clans stretched long, even here, in the silent, mighty heart of the untouched mountains. Their story was not over, it had simply changed its landscape. Their sod hut, which had felt so sturdy in the autumn, was tested. Snowdrifts piled against the door, and the cold seeped through every tiny crevice. They spent days confined inside, their world shrunk to the flickering light of a seal-fat lamp and the shared warmth of their bodies under a growing pile of furs. The silence outside was absolute, a thick blanket smothering the world, broken only by the occasional thunderous crash of a snowslide in the distance. It was during this deep isolation that the past found its way in, not through track or smoke signal, but through dreams. Nannook was the first to be visited. She dreamt of her father, Chogon. But he was not the stern, disappointed chief of her last memory. He was sitting alone by the central fire in their lodge, his shoulders slumped. The fire was guttering, low and weak. He held a carving, a small, clumsy figure of a polar bear she had made for him as a child. In the dream, he was not angry. He was grieving, a deep, silent sorrow that radiated from him like cold from stone. He looked up, and his eyes, dark pools of loss, seemed to see her standing in the shadows. "The heart of the wolf is cold without its pack," he murmured, his voice echoing as if from a great distance. Then the dream shifted, and she saw the Mahkah village shrouded in a strange, lethargic stillness. The people moved like spirits through a mist, their war chants silent, their eyes hollow. The spirit of the wolf, she felt, was not prowling for battle, it was mourning, curled and lonely. She woke with a start, her own heart aching. The dream felt more like a vision, a message sent on the cold wind. It was not the search party of a vengeful chieftain she had feared, but the profound grief of a father. She lay in the dark, listening to Kanti's steady breathing, and felt a new, complicated pang of guilt. Kanti's dream came the next night. She found herself on the shores of the great lake of her people, but the water was unervingly still, like a sheet of dark glass. The eagle, her clan's totem, was perched on a dead tree, its majestic wings drooping, its head bowed. Her father, Ahanu, stood at the water's edge, but his face was not contorted in rage. It was etched with a confusion so deep it bordered on despair. He was looking down at his reflection in the water, but it did not show his own face. It shimmered and showed Kanti's face, then Nannook's, then both together. He recoiled, stumbling back, and the surface of the lake shattered into 1,000 ripples. A voice, not his own but ancient and watery, whispered, "The eagle is blinded by the storm it itself created." She woke with a gasp, feeling the chill of the lake water on her skin though she was dry. She told Nannook of the dream over a breakfast of melted snow and dried berries. "It was not anger I felt from him," Kanti whispered, her eyes wide. "It was brokenness. The certainty he always had is gone. It is like we have not just left, but we have taken the meaning of the fight with us." The shared dreams were a form of magic they had not anticipated, a spiritual connection that transcended distance, weaving their fates with those they had left behind in ways more intimate and unsettling than any physical pursuit. They were not being hunted, they were being mourned, and their absence was causing a sickness of the spirit in both clans. This knowledge sat heavily upon them. Their flight, which had been an act of survival and love, now also felt like an act of profound spiritual consequence. They had not just saved themselves, they had, inadvertently, stolen the very reason for the clan's conflict, leaving behind a void that festered. The deep snows eventually relented, yielding to a period of brittle, clear cold. The need for fresh meat became urgent. Their stores were dwindling, and the mountain goats were becoming scarce, driven to lower elevations by the severity of the winter. Nannook prepared for a longer hunt, one that would take her several days into a neighboring valley known for its herds. "I do not like it," Kanti said, her brow furrowed as she checked the bindings on Nannook's snowshoes. "The spirits are restless. I feel a tension in the air." "The spirits are always restless in this cold," Nannook replied, trying to sound reassuring. But she felt it too, a prickling on the back of her neck, a sense of being watched by the immense, silent white world. "I will be careful. I will return in 3 days, no more." Their parting was heavy with unspoken fear. The specter of the hunting parties and the weight of the dreams made the wilderness feel newly threatening. Nannook's hunt was initially successful. She found the goat trail and followed it to a high basin, where she managed to bring down a young kid with a single clean throw of her spear. The work of skinning and butchering the animal was arduous in the deep cold, her fingers growing numb despite her fur mittens. As she worked, the feeling of being watched intensified. She scanned the cliffs constantly, seeing nothing but snow and rock. It was on her journey back, the heavy pack of meat and hide on her shoulders, that she saw it. A footprint. It was partially filled with fresh snow, but its outline was unmistakable. It was a snowshoe print, but not of her own making. The pattern was different, wider, of a design she recognized with a jolt of ice in her veins. Tikaani. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She dropped into a crouch, her eyes frantically scanning the pristine slopes around her. There was no one. Just the endless, watchful white. She followed the track with her eyes. It was a single set, moving parallel to her own path, about 50 paces away, before disappearing over a ridge. It was not the track of a hunting party. It was a scout. A lone Tikaani scout had been watching her. Panic threatened to choke her. Had they found their valley? Their hut? Was Kanti safe? The meat on her back suddenly felt like a betrayal. It sent a beacon leading their enemy right to their door. Every instinct screamed at her to abandon the pack, to run light and fast back to Kanti. But the practical part of her, the survivor, knew the meat was their life. They could not afford to lose it. She changed her route, taking a longer, more difficult path over a treacherous scree slope, hoping to obscure her trail. She moved with a frantic energy, her ears straining for any sound beyond the crunch of her own snowshoes and the rush of the wind. She saw no further sign of the scout, but the feeling of eyes on her back never left. When she finally stumbled into their valley as the sun was setting on the second day, a day earlier than planned, she was near exhaustion, her nerves frayed raw. Kanti was outside, chopping ice from the hot spring pool. She looked up, her face initially bright with relief at Nannook's early return, then immediately darkening with alarm at the fear etched on Nannook's features. "What is it?" Kanti asked, dropping the axe and rushing to her. "Tracks," Nannook gasped, shrugging off the heavy pack. "Tikaani snowshoe. A scout. He was watching me." Kanti's face went pale. She helped Nannook inside the hut, and as the story tumbled out, her own fear solidified into a cold, hard dread. The outside world had not just sent dreams, it had sent a physical manifestation of its relentless reach. "He was alone?" Kanti asked, her voice low. Nannook nodded. "As far as I could tell. But if one scout can find this area, others can follow." That night, they did not sleep. They sat in the dark, listening to the wind, every gust sounding like an approaching footstep. The sanctuary they had built felt violated. The peace they had carved out was an illusion. The feud was a beast that would not die, and it had caught their scent. "We cannot stay," Kanti said finally, as the first gray light of dawn filtered through the smoke hole. The words were a death sentence to the home they had built with their own hands. "Where would we go?" Nannook's voice was hollow. "North is only higher, colder mountains. We would not survive the heart of winter there." "Then we do not run further," Kanti said, a new, fierce determination hardening her words. "We turn back." Nannook stared at her. "Back? To the clans? They will kill us. Or worse, they will separate us." "Not to the villages," Kanti said. "To the river. To the place where it began." Understanding dawned on Nannook. The Tapu. The spirit crossing. The one place that existed outside the boundaries of either clan, a place that had already once rewritten their destiny. "The spirits there spoke to us," Kanti continued. "They stayed my hand. They brought us together. If the feud is a sickness of the spirit, then perhaps that is the only place a healing can begin. We cannot outrun this. Perhaps we must face it. Not with weapons, but with the truth that place showed us." It was a desperate plan, born of desperation. To return to the very border of the warring territories was to walk into the jaws of the beast. But to stay in the mountains was to wait for the beast to find them. And the dreams had shown them a different reality, not of vengeful hunters, but of grieving, confused people whose spiritual world was crumbling. They were not just two lovers running away anymore. The dreams, the scout, these were signs. They were being pulled back. Their story was not a separate thread, it was still tightly woven into the fabric of their people's fate. They had tried to cut it, but it would not break. The only choice left was to follow it back to its source and see if the pattern could be changed. With heavy hearts, they began to pack. They would take only what they could carry, the essential tools, the dried meat, their furs. They would abandon the hut, the symbol of their brief, beautiful independence. They were no longer fleeing from something. They were journeying towards something, a reckoning they could no longer avoid. The path ahead was fraught with more danger than any mountain pass, for it led back into the heart of the hatred they had escaped, armed with nothing but the fragile hope they had found in a river's pool. Their exile was over. A new, even more perilous chapter was beginning. The journey south was a somber mirror of their flight north. The same mountains, now viewed from the opposite direction, seemed to watch their passage with stoic indifference. The weight they carried was no longer just of supplies and furs, but of purpose and dread. They moved with a grim efficiency, their senses stretched taut, every shadow scrutinized for the threat of a Mahkah hunter or a Tikaani scout. The dream visions of their grieving fathers hung between them, a silent, shared burden that made the prospect of confrontation even more painful. They avoided the known paths and hunting grounds, navigating by the position of the sun by day and the familiar constellations by night. The further south they descended, the more the deep snows receded, giving way to the frozen, brittle landscape of the lower forests. The air lost its killing edge, but the tension within them did not lessen. They were entering the dragon's lair by choice. After 5 days of cautious travel, the scent of the forest changed. The clean, icy smell of the high peaks was replaced by the familiar damp odor of pine and loam, and beneath it, a faint, acrid hint of wood smoke. They were close to the contested lands. That night, as they made a cold camp in a thicket of brambles, they heard it, the distant, unmistakable sound of drums. It was not the steady, rhythmic beat of a ceremony. It was a frantic, pounding pulse, a heart beating itself into a frenzy. Then came the answering drums from a different direction. Mahkah and Tikaani, speaking to each other in the only language they seemed to remember, the language of war. Kanti's hand found Nannook's in the dark, her grip tight. "They are preparing," she whispered, her voice thick with dread. "The drums. They are calling for a gathering of strength. It is a prelude to a great battle." Nannook listened, her own heart thudding in time with the ominous rhythm. The dreams had not lied. Their absence had not brought a weary peace. It had stripped away the last restraints, allowing the hatred to boil over into what promised to be a final, devastating conflict. Their return was not a moment too soon, yet it felt like they were two sparrows trying to halt an avalanche. The next morning, they reached the Eye-Caught-Me River. It was not the serene, magical place of their first meeting. Winter had gripped it in a stark beauty. The banks were edged with ice, and the water, black and swift, flowed with a cold, purposeful energy. The weeping willows were skeletal, their bare branches clicking together in the wind like old bones. The sense of the Tapu, the thinness of the world, was even stronger here, charged by the proximity of the war drums. They stood hand in hand on the bank, looking at the pool where an arrow had once flown and changed everything. "This is where we make our stand," Nannook said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried a firmness that belied her fear. "We do not stand with weapons," Kanti replied, her gaze fixed on the water. "We stand with the truth of this place." They built a small, humble fire on the very spot where Kanti had nursed Nannook back to health. It was not a fire for warmth or cooking, but a signal fire, a declaration of their presence in this sacred, neutral space. They sat beside it, waiting. They did not have to wait long. The first to arrive were Mahkah scouts, drawn by the smoke from their fire, a brazen act in the contested zone. 3 young warriors emerged from the treeline, their faces painted with streaks of black wolf paw. They froze when they saw the 2 figures by the fire, their hands going to their weapons. Recognition flashed in their eyes, followed by confusion and suspicion. "Nannook." One of them breathed, his spear lowering slightly. They said you were dead. Or enchanted. I am neither, she said, rising to her feet, her posture straight and proud. I am here by my own will. Return to Chogon. Tell him his daughter waits for him at the spirit crossing. Tell him I bring a message that cannot be ignored. The scouts hesitated, their eyes flicking to Kanti, who remained seated by the fire, her presence a silent challenge. Finally, the leader gave a sharp nod and they melted back into the forest, moving with the swift, alarmed energy of men who had seen a ghost. Not an hour later, a Tikaani patrol appeared on the opposite bank. Their reaction was identical: shock, disbelief, and a swift, fearful retreat to carry the news to Ahanu. The sun climbed to its zenith. The drums, which had fallen silent for a time, began again, their rhythm changed. Now it was a beat of confusion, of summons, of leaders calling their people to witness something inexplicable. And they came. Not as small scouting parties, but as clans. From the forest emerged the Mahkah, led by Chogon. His face was a mask of stern authority, but Nannook could see the cracks in it, the confusion and the desperate hope she had seen in her dream warring with his chieftain's demeanor. Behind him were dozens of his people, their faces hard and curious. From the opposite direction came the Tikaani, Ahanu at their forefront. His expression was thunderous, his hand clenched tightly around the haft of his spear. His eyes found Kanti first, and in them was a fury so hot it seemed to melt the winter air around him. His people fanned out behind him, a wall of simmering hostility. The two clans lined the opposite banks of the river, the black water flowing between them like a line of division drawn by the spirits themselves. The air crackled with decades of hatred, suspicion, and now, profound bewilderment. The object of their mutual animosity was not across the river, but shared between them, sitting together at a single fire. Chogon was the first to break the silence, his voice cutting across the water like a knife. Nannook, step away from that creature and come to your people. Her witchcraft ends now. There is no witchcraft here, father, Nannook called back, her voice clear and strong, carrying over the murmur of the crowd. There is only truth. A truth this place showed us. Ahanu snarled, stepping to the very edge of the icy bank. Kanti, you have been deceived. That wolf has clouded your mind. Return to your clan and renounce this madness. Kanti stood now, moving to stand shoulder to shoulder with Nannook. My mind has never been clearer, father, she replied, her voice quieter than Nannook's but no less firm. It is the hatred that clouds our vision. It is the feud that is the madness. A ripple of anger and disbelief went through both crowds. Shouts of traitor and witch erupted from both sides, aimed at both women. They were surrounded by a sea of their own people, yet they had never been more alone. You see. Chogon roared, gesturing at the two of them. The Tikaani poison has turned her against her own blood. You see the Mahkah cunning. Ahanu shot back. They have broken my daughter's spirit. The old pattern was reasserting itself instantly, using the two women as new fuel for the same old fire. Despair threatened to swallow Nannook. They weren't listening. They would never listen. But then Kanti did something unexpected. She did not argue. She did not plead. She turned from the chiefs and addressed the river, the trees, the very air of the Tapu. Spirits of this place, she called out, her voice taking on a resonant, ceremonial tone. You who stayed my hand. You who brought us together. We have returned. We ask you now, show them. Show them the truth you showed us. Break the blindness that binds our people. A hush fell. It was a desperate, crazy act. A petition to the unseen. The warriors on both banks shifted uneasily, superstitious fear mingling with their anger. For a long moment, nothing happened. Ahanu opened his mouth to scoff, a cruel laugh beginning to form on his lips. And then the wind died. The constant sighing through the pines ceased utterly. The clicking willow branches fell still. The world was plunged into an unnatural, waiting silence. The only sound was the rush of the black water. Then, a light began to glow from within the pool where Nannook had been wounded. It was a soft, phosphorescent blue, emanating from the depths, causing the water to shimmer with an unearthly luminescence. From the light, tendrils of mist began to rise, not like ordinary steam but forming shapes. The shapes of two women, echoes of Nannook and Kanti, meeting by the water. The misty figure of Kanti drew a bow, loosed an arrow, and then waded into the water not to kill, but to save. The silent, glowing play showed her building a shelter, gathering herbs, the two figures talking, growing closer, until finally they embraced. The clans watched, utterly mesmerized and terrified. This was no trickery. This was magic of the oldest, deepest kind. The spirit of the place was telling a story, and it was not a story of corruption or kidnapping. It was a story of compassion, healing, and love. The misty figures dissolved. The light in the pool faded. The wind returned with a gentle sigh. The silence that followed was different. The anger was gone, replaced by awe and a deep, unsettling confusion. The foundation of their hatred had been publicly and supernaturally undermined. It was Chogon who broke the silence this time, his voice hoarse, all the bluster gone out of it. He was looking not at Nannook, but at the now still pool of water. You saved her?" he asked, the question directed at Kanti. Kanti met his gaze across the water. "Yes." Ahanu was staring at his daughter, his face pale. The vision had shown not a broken spirit, but a strong, compassionate healer. It had shown not a victim, but a woman making her own choices. "And you went with her?" "Willingly." "I did," Nannook answered, her voice soft but carrying to every ear. "Because she showed me that the enemy was not a monster. She was a person. Just like me. We are not so different, our peoples. We both love this land. We both grieve our lost ones. We both fear each other. The fear has ruled us for too long." She turned to face the Mahkah. The spirit of the wolf is not meant to hunt its own reflection forever. It is meant to protect its pack, to care for its home. She then turned to the Tikaani. The spirit of the eagle is not meant to only see prey. It is meant to see the whole land, to soar above petty conflicts and understand the greater pattern. The words, coming on the heels of the spiritual vision, landed not as treason, but as prophecy. An old woman, Kanti's grandmother, pushed her way to the front of the Tikaani crowd. Her face was wrinkled like a dried apple, but her eyes were sharp. She looked at the two young women, then at the chiefs. "The Tapu has spoken," she said, her voice raspy but powerful. "It has shown us a path away from the cliff. Will we take it? Or will we, in our pride, step off into the darkness anyway?" The fight went out of Ahanu then. His shoulders slumped. He looked from the old woman to his daughter, and the furious, certain chief was gone, leaving only a tired, confused man who had just seen his entire worldview shattered by a river spirit. Chogon slowly walked down the bank and into the freezing water, wading across the shallow ford of the river until he stood on the other side, facing the Tikaani. It was an unimaginable act. He stopped before Ahanu. The two chiefs, whose eyes had only ever met in hatred across a battlefield, looked at each other now in the wake of a miracle. "My daughter lives because of yours," Chogon said, the words clearly costing him a great effort. "For that, I owe you a debt that cannot be paid with blood." Ahanu looked at the man who had been his nemesis for decades. He saw the same grief he carried, the same weariness. He gave a slow, stiff nod. "And my daughter's spirit is whole because of yours." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "The eagles and the wolves. We have been fighting a shadow. Perhaps it is time we learned to see the sun." It was not a treaty. It was not a declaration of friendship. It was a crack in a wall that had stood for generations. But it was a start. Nannook and Kanti watched, their hands clasped so tightly their knuckles were white, as the two clans, for the first time in living memory, did not advance on each other with weapons, but remained on their banks, speaking in low, uncertain murmurs, the drums of war silent. They had not been welcomed back with open arms. The suspicion and fear would take a long time to fade. But they had not been killed. They had been heard. The spirits had spoken for them. Their love had not just saved them. It had, against all odds, forced a ceasefire. It had not ended the feud, that would be the work of a lifetime, but it had planted a seed of doubt in the heart of the hatred. And sometimes, a single seed was all that was needed to eventually crack stone. The story of Nannook and Kanti, the wolf and the eagle, would be told forever after, not as a story of betrayal, but as the story of the day the river itself spoke, and the long war began to end. Their journey was complete. They had found their peace, not in running away, but in returning to face the storm together, and in doing so, they had finally begun to calm it.